All right, now we're going to turn our attention to the topic of emotions. And for some reason, I'm not sure why, this is really a fun topic for me to teach. And the way I like to approach it is by presenting questions and then answering them to the extent that current research permits. Cannot guarantee that you're going to get definitive or satisfactory answers to these questions, but I want you to think about them. The first question is, what emotions can we experience? If you think about it, there are many, many words that we use to describe our emotional experiences. But psychologists, as you'll read in your textbook, tend to suggest that there are probably just about maybe 6 to 8 pure emotions that we experience. However, we may experience more than one type of emotion simultaneously, giving rise to a different emotional experience. For instance, we might experience fear and pleasure at the same time, and the result would be something that we might describe as guilt. We might also experience emotions at varying intensities. For instance, I might experience pleasure, and if it's more intense, I might describe it as joy, or if it's at a very high intensity, then I might call it ecstasy. So basically, the idea is that there are a few pure emotions that we might experience at varying intensities and in combination. Here's another important question about emotions. How do we know what emotions we are experiencing at any moment in time? And I want you to know the James-Lange theory of emotion, which basically states that our emotions are the result of physiological or behavioral changes. Now, the James-Lange theory of emotion was presented by two scientists working independently, William James, an American psychologist, and Carl Lange, a Danish physiologist. They essentially came up with the same idea at about the same time, so it's named for both of them. Some of you might be familiar with the term zeitgeist. At any rate, the James-Lange theory of emotion is embodied by the statement, "I'm afraid because I run." Now, I would be willing to bet that this is the opposite of what you would normally say in your daily life. I think most people tend to say, "I am running because I'm afraid." If you say, "I'm running because I'm afraid," then the assumption is that you feel fear, an emotion, and that it causes your behavior to change. According to the James-Lange theory of emotion, it's exactly the opposite. You experience an emotion because you're running, because of your behavior, or because of a change in your physiological state. The James-Lange theory of emotion is actually counterintuitive for most of us. And I want you to be clear about which occurs first when we experience emotions. According to the James-Lange theory, it's our physiological changes or our behavior. So according to the James-Lange theory, I know that I'm afraid because my heartbeat is rapid. Or I know I'm embarrassed because my face is blushing. Or I know I'm happy because I'm smiling. In each case, the behavior or physiological change comes first, and it gives rise to an emotional experience. The James-Lange theory of emotions is taught in pretty much every general psychology course, which means that there's some support for it. But there is also criticism of the James-Lange theory of emotions, and some of these criticisms were put forth by Walter B. Cannon in the 1920s, arguing vehemently against the James-Lange theory. One of his arguments was that our autonomic nervous system changes are too slow to account for our emotions. And you can see why this would be evidence against James-Lange theory. If our emotions are faster than our autonomic nervous system changes, then our autonomic nervous system responses could not be causing changes in our emotions. Now, this is not the best argument against James-Lange theory. Some autonomic nervous system changes are too slow to account for our emotions, but others are rapid enough to do so. Another argument against James-Lange, presented by Cannon, was that not all autonomic nervous system changes are associated with changes in emotions. For instance, you might exercise. That causes physiological changes in your bodies, but it does not necessarily result in a change in your emotional experiences. Or I might inject you, I wouldn't, it's unethical, but imagine that I injected you with adrenaline. That would speed up your heart rate, your breathing rate, and yet it would not necessarily result in a change in your emotional state. So, not all autonomic nervous system changes are associated with changes in emotions, and this would seem like a more credible criticism of James-Lange theory than the first. Finally, if James-Lange theory were true, then there should be specific patterns of physiological changes associated with specific emotions. I should be able to look at your pattern of physiological change. Your breathing rate is this, your heart rate is this, your pupillary response is such and such, your galvanic skin response or the amount of perspiration across the palms of your hands is this. And so I should be able to look at that pattern of physiological change and identify your emotion that you're experiencing if James-Lange theory were true. Now, we don't know if this is going to be possible eventually, that we would be able to look at someone's body state and identify the specific emotion that they're experiencing. We don't know if it's impossible to do this or if we just do not yet have the technology for being able to identify specific emotions based on physiological change. At any rate, there is credible evidence against the James-Lange theory of emotions. However, as I mentioned, it is taught in pretty much every general psychology course, so obviously there's some support for this theory. First of all, simulating emotions can give rise to those associated emotional states. If you walk around smiling, then the idea is that you're going to be more likely to feel happy. But this is not a well-controlled research situation, because if you walk around smiling, other people are going to smile back at you, and that also could affect your mood state. However, this type of research has been conducted under laboratory, well-controlled conditions. So if you were a participant in a research study like this, you might be asked to lean forward in your chair. Go ahead and try it. And I want you to push your eyebrows together as much as you can and hold that position. I want you to lower the right corner of your mouth and then lower the left corner of your mouth and hold that position. And then I want you to tighten your hands into fists as hard as you can and hold that position as well. And if you are simulating emotion, think about what emotion you're simulating here. You are probably appearing very angry, and in laboratory conditions where participants are not told the purpose of the research, then they are likely to experience some degree of anger. Another example, let's try this and see if it works for you. I want you to relax your body, shake your shoulders a little bit and loosen them up, and I want you to raise the right corner of your mouth and raise the left corner of your mouth. Hold it. I want you to raise your eyebrows just a little bit. Now, what emotion is being expressed here? If I were to be able to see you, I would say that you look happy. And in laboratory conditions, when participants do not know the purpose of the research, simulating happiness like this does tend to result in a changed mood state. So again, simulating emotions can give rise to the associated emotions. And this supports James-Lange theory because it's basically behavioral changes occurring first, and those give rise to changes in emotions. Another piece of evidence supporting James-Lange theory is that physiological arousal can intensify our emotions. I said earlier that you could exercise or be injected with adrenaline that would change your physiological state and not necessarily result in a change in emotions. However, if you're in a residual state of arousal from exercise and then you're in a situation that induces anger, then you're going to experience more intense anger. Or if you're in a residual state of arousal from exercise and you are placed in a situation where you experience fear, then that fear could be more intense. So this does provide some support for James-Lange theory. Another piece of evidence supporting James-Lange theory is the finding that false feedback about physiological changes can affect our emotions. Now, this research has been criticized a great deal in the past because it primarily involved testing male participants, and it's difficult to then generalize to others in the population. But the findings of these studies do support James-Lange theory. Here's an example. Male participants were asked to look at a series of erotic images. And they were told, and this was deception, by the way, they were told that they would be hearing the sound of their own heartbeats while they look at these images. But the researchers actually used pre-recorded heartbeats that were sometimes speeded up and associated with specific images being presented to the participants. Then the participants were asked afterwards about which of these images they found to be most arousing. And the ones that had been associated with the speeded up heartbeat tended to be selected by participants as the more erotic images. So basically, for these individuals, the false feedback about their own physiological states influenced their emotional reactions. Last but not least, as a piece of evidence for James-Lange theory, we know that high-level spinal cord damage can reduce the intensity of emotions. Now, high-level spinal cord damage reduces the physiological input to the brain about the body state. When it's high-level spinal cord damage, there is less information traveling from the body up the spinal cord to the brain, and the brain has less information about the body's physiological state. When an accident like this occurs, causing high-level spinal cord damage, then it appears that individuals experience less intense emotions. That seems to support the James-Lange theory of emotion. But it's not a perfect piece of evidence. No piece of evidence is ever perfect. If you think about it, when someone is in such a traumatic type of accident and they're experiencing this type of injury, then there are psychological processes that result in emotional blunting as well. So that's a potential confound. But again, it is a piece of evidence supporting James-Lange theory. So there's evidence against James-Lange theory, and there's evidence supporting James-Lange theory. So the next question becomes, how can we resolve the issue? But first, let me mention that as you're studying the topic of emotion, I want you to not just understand James-Lange theory of emotion, but I want you to be able to identify a piece of evidence as supporting the theory or as evidence against the theory. This is a critical thinking skill that I think is important. But again, you've got evidence for, you've got evidence against. How do we resolve the issue? One suggestion in the history of psychology has involved the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions. It's also called attribution of arousal theory. That's how your textbook refers to it. But I like the term Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions because it has a mnemonic device. Two factors give rise to our emotional changes. Basically, according to the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions, our emotional states are the result of both physiological change and a cognitive appraisal of the situation. So it's not just physiological change alone, according to this theory, that gives rise to changes in our emotional states. It also involves a cognitive appraisal of the situation. So I might be walking down a dark street at night. For some reason, all the street lights are out, and I hear footsteps behind me. When I stop, they stop. When I start walking again, I start hearing the footsteps again. And I am perhaps feeling change in my physiological state, But if a friend comes up to me and taps me on the shoulder and I turn around and see it's a friend of mine, then I'm going to cognitively appraise the situation as safe. And so I would not, at that point anyway, experience fear. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions is quite famous in psychology, and it was presented along with the results of a classic study in the field. I'd like you to know the details of this study as well as the findings and why it was important. So here's what the researchers Schachter and Singer did that provided evidence for their two-factor theory of emotions. They basically asked some participants to be injected with adrenaline, telling them that it was a vitamin called Ciproxin. No such thing. That was deception. They were just being injected with adrenaline and then being deceived about the drug itself. Other participants were injected with the same drug, but they were told the truth. They were told that the drug was adrenaline, and so they expected to experience changes in their physiological states as a result of the injection. Now, all of the participants were then placed in these situations with actors. In some of these situations, an actor in the room would be behaving very angrily, ranting and raving and, balling up sheets of paper and throwing it. And when participants were told that they were injected with the vitamin Ciproxin and placed with an actor who was behaving in an angry fashion, then self-reports after the experiment indicated that they too felt angry. Think about it. They didn't know that their change in physiological state was a result of the drug injection. So they attributed it to the situation with the individual who was behaving in an angry fashion. Other participants were placed in situations after receiving their injection. They were placed in situations where the actor acted really happy, in fact, giddy, laughing, joking, throwing paper airplanes around. And when participants were told that the injection was the vitamin, i.e., they were deceived about it, then they too, in self-reports later, indicated they experienced an emotional change of happiness. Whereas participants who knew that the drug injection was going to result in a change in their physiological state did not report a change in their emotions. So the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions did seem to indicate that it's not just physiological change that gives rise to changes in our emotional states. There's also cognitive appraisal that influences our emotions, our appraisal of a situation. More recently, the Schachter-Singer theory has been criticized. One criticism I've encountered fairly recently was that other researchers tried to replicate the study and failed to do so. That always looks bad for researchers. And I think at this point it's not clear whether it was an inability to conduct the experiment in the same fashion that Schachter-Singer did, replicating their results, or whether it just couldn't be done. Another criticism of Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotions has to do with that phrase, cognitive appraisal. I'm not sure that that is the best wording. It sounds like a pretty high-level executive function, and we don't really know what other factor or factors influence our emotional states. Next, we should talk about the physiology of emotions, the part of our nervous systems that are involved in our emotional experiences. So the autonomic nervous system, you already know, is very important for our emotional experiences. Just to give you one illustration, take polygraph testing. I think most people know that polygraph testing is lie detection. However, polygraph testing is not a reliable testing technique, and it's not allowed in our court systems today. However, it's frequently used by law enforcement. Now, what does polygraph testing do? It basically is measuring your breathing rate, your heart rate, your galvanic skin response, or the amount of perspiration across the palms of your hands, and so on. And it is thought by some people that one's pattern of physiological responding can indicate whether or not one is being deceptive or truthful. Again, these tests are prone to false positives, so they are not considered entirely credible, and they're not accepted, the results are not accepted in our courts of law, which makes me feel slightly less unethical by telling you how to cheat on a polygraph test. And hopefully you'll never need to do this. And I actually don't even recommend it for a variety of reasons. But if you think about how polygraph testing traditionally took place, there would be a baseline, essentially measurements of your physiological state taken when you are being asked innocuous questions, questions that should not upset you in any way. What was your mother's maiden name? Where were you born? And then the baseline responding would be compared to responding during a time period when the important questions are asked. Where were you on the night of December 7th, 2019? Or have you ever shoplifted? Maybe you'll take a polygraph test someday because you're applying for a job and they'll ask you that. Now, it's unethical probably for me to tell you this, in part because it's lab lore and I don't know that it works. Certainly haven't tried it myself. But if you put a tack in your shoe and during the baseline recording the innocuous questions, you press your toe against that tack, then the difference between the baseline and the portion of the polygraph test when you're being asked sensitive questions might be lessened. There'll be less of a difference. Don't recommend it. I think if you're caught with a tack in your shoe and trying to cheat on a polygraph test, you'll be in more trouble than when you started. But it's a memorable example, and I want you to know that the autonomic nervous system is definitely involved in our emotional experiences. Then there's the hypothalamus. You knew this already. The hypothalamus, some people consider it part of the limbic system, is certainly involved in our emotional experiences. In fact, there's a phenomenon called feline rage, where if a microelectrode is placed into a certain part of the hypothalamus of a cat, and then it is electrically or chemically stimulated in that portion of the brain, the animal goes into an immediate rage. And I think most people know what an angry cat looks like. It has its ears flattened, it is hissing and spitting, back is arched, there's piloerection so that the fur is standing straight up, has that very bushy tail. And then if you turn the stimulation off, it is a sweet little pussycat again. Turn it on, the animal's enraged. So that shows that the hypothalamus is definitely involved in emotions. You know this already. You've been taught this in the biological foundation. The limbic system is also involved in our emotional experiences, particularly the septal area and the amygdala. Now, we've known for decades as scientists that there are areas of the hypothalamus and the limbic system that have been described as pleasure centers or pain centers. In fact, it's been shown that a rat that has been reinforced by electrical or chemical stimulation of one of the so-called pleasure centers will work very hard in order to receive that stimulation. In fact, pushing a lever 20,000 times in order to be stimulated in the brain in that fashion. Likewise, there are pain centers in the brain, and a rat will press a lever many, many, many times in order to avoid stimulation of one of the so-called pain centers. Last, let's talk about the cerebral cortex, also part of our emotional experiences. Some of the classic research in this area involved taking photographs of people's faces after they were asked to express different emotions, such as anger, joy, disgust, fear. And then those photographs were modified so that each new photograph contained two left sides of a person's face or two right sides of a person's face. And one half of the image was flipped so that it actually looked like a normal face for each type of photograph. Then those composite modified photographs were shown to people who were asked to identify the emotions being expressed. And it turns out that the left side composite photos were far more easy for people to identify the emotions compared to the right side composite photos. Let's try something. I want you to pull up a photograph of yourself. It might be your student ID, or maybe you're at your computer and you can pull up some photographs of your face. And I want you to draw a line vertically in your imagination down the middle of your face, from the top of your head to your chin. Compare the left side of your face to the right side of the face. And this will work, of course, if you're right-handed. I want you to look at the corner of your mouth. Which side, right or left, is turned up more when you're smiling? Which corner of your eye, left or right, is more crinkled if you're smiling? And for most people, if they're right-handed, the left side of your face is more expressive. So think back to what we learned regarding the biological foundation. Which hemisphere of your brain controls the left side of your face? It would be the right hemisphere because it's contralateral control. So yes, the cerebral cortex is very much involved in our emotional expressions and experiences, and in particular, the right hemisphere for right-handed people is important. When we talk about emotions, we should also consider nature and nurture and their roles in development. Cross-cultural studies of emotions are very interesting. They have shown that there are cultural display roles that affect when we express emotions and how intensely we express them, and that this varies across cultures. In the classic study showing cultural display roles, participants were college students, some of whom were Japanese American students and the others who were not of Japanese heritage. And they were shown a film, and it was basically kind of a distressing film to watch. It was a film showing coming of age rituals in a tribal population. This coming of age ritual was essentially circumcision without an anesthetic. So it's a distressing film to watch. And what the researchers found was that when you have half of the Japanese American students and half of the remaining students watch this film in groups, and the other half watching the film alone, then the Japanese American students tended to not express emotion as much when they observed the film in a group compared to when they observed the film alone. Whereas the remaining participants without the Japanese heritage tended to not show any difference in the intensity of their emotions watching the film, whether they were in a group or not. So it appears that there are cultural display rules, and essentially our cultures tell us or teach us when we should express emotion and how intensely to express it in different situations. Now, thinking about it, there's no right or wrong here. It's just a matter of there are differences, diversity that just makes human behavior all that much more interesting. So definitely environment, culture plays a role in our emotional experiences and our emotional expressions. But biology also plays a role. Genetic inheritance, of course, plays a role in our emotions. For instance, another piece of classic research, a psychologist took photographs of people's faces after they were asked to display different kinds of emotions, for instance, anger, joy, disgust, fear, and then took those photographs around the world and showed them to people from different cultures. And there are several emotions that seem to be recognized by people across the globe. For instance, if you ask someone in another culture, which of these photographs would be associated with receiving a gift that you like very much, they'll pick out the one with a happy face. If you ask them which of these photographs represents an individual when somebody they cared for deeply died, then they're going to pick out a sad photograph. So that implies that there's some universality and that genetic inheritance plays a role in our emotions. Last but not least, another piece of evidence that biology plays a role in our emotions: blind babies smile. Even without ever seeing another human face, blind babies will smile. However, environment plays a role as well, because as time passes, blind babies tend to smile less and less compared to babies that have their vision. And so the fact that they're not seeing other faces smile tends to reduce the frequency with which these babies smile. But this too provides evidence that our biology affects our emotions, although environment also always plays a role.